Welcome to this week's episode of Whiteboard Learning. Today we're going to talk about salmon poisoning since we've had a couple cases recently. So this is my depiction of a salmon. Don't laugh. Salmon poisoning is not actually a poisoning. It's really an infection. So if you think about salmon poisoning, that's kind of a silly thing. Some people call it fish infection, which is weird too, or fish disease. That's weird. So anyway, what happens in salmon poisoning? Well, the interesting thing about salmon poisoning is how complex the number of organisms is that you have to deal with here. But basically, it all hinges on the life cycle of a fluke, which is a little kind of parasite. And so the fluke likes to live first in a little snail, and the snail carries the fluke to a certain point. So there'll be a little fluke egg in the snail, and then that's released. And then it gets into the fish through the skin of the fish when it's in a creek or something, and then it infects the fish, and it can go to the kidneys and the muscle and the intestines. And then what's supposed to happen is it's supposed to go to a bird or to a mammal and some sort of animal. Here, I'll make a bear, teddy bear. And when it gets to either of those guys, then it's passed on through them and goes through their poop and goes back to the snail. So the fluke is called Nanophyades salmonella, because it gets into the salmon. And interestingly, it can be a salmon or a trout or a salamander. And it really, why salmon poisoning is only a Northwest thing is because of the snail. So the snail is really only in the creeks and small waters of the Northwest. So this all hinges kind of on the snail. So this fluke has this life cycle. Now the problem will be when the fluke is infected with a rickettsia. And rickettsia are a subcategory of bacteria. The cool part about them is as bacteria, they have to live inside a cell. And they cannot live outside the cell. Like many of our bacteria live in our skin or in the intestine, they have to be in a cell. So they are inside this, the fluke. So if the fluke is in here, and then you'll have the rickettsia infect the fluke. And if it stays in the fluke, it's not that big a deal. Rickettsia are mostly what we think of when we think of tick-borne diseases, because the rickettsia has to live inside the tick. So those are Lyme, Anaplasma, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and why Ehrlichia. And why that's important is because they cause a disease that's a lot like those. So this rickettsia that lives inside the fluke, the fluke gets infected, is called Neorickettsia. Helminthica. And a helminth is basically a worm. And so that word makes sense because of the helminth worm, the fluke is the kind of a worm. So this is a rickettsia that lives in a worm, and the worm is Nanophyades salmonella. Let's see if I can make that look better. Okay, so what happens? Well, the dog is not good at being the carrier of this fluke and the rickettsia. It is an abnormal host. So when you get to a dog, then this all becomes a problem. Now, what other, besides dogs, so dog family includes wolves and coyotes, to name a few. But if you think about bears, raccoons, and other mammals, they do not get infected like this. They can't get salmon poisoning. So it's something about being a dog. Even a cat can't get this if it eats the fish. So what happens is the dog comes along and eats raw fish, which has the fluke carrying the rickettsia, and then it's an abnormal host. The fluke itself doesn't do too much to the dog, but the rickettsia organism is bad. So this is a little bit like Rocky Mountain spotted fever and anaplasma. So this little rickettsia is released into the body after it's inside the dog and wants to go inside a cell. So it likes to go inside your white blood cells and get carried all over the body and cause a vasculitis, and especially in the intestines, a little bit like parvo, so vomiting and diarrhea and increased size of lymph nodes and swelling and fever. So a lot of the things you kind of think about when you think about some of the other tick-borne diseases. It usually takes about 5 to 7 days after eating the raw salmon. Now it has to be raw because the organisms are killed by cooking. So it's a very interesting disease. The big treatment is just like all other tick-borne disease that we usually use, which is doxycycline. And we do also treat the fluke because that can cause diarrhea, and that's praziquantel. So that's more of a dewormer. But doxycycline is the main treatment for all tick-borne diseases at this current time. So let's review that one last time. There's a fluke that has an interesting life cycle that normally goes from a snail to a fish to a mammal or bird, and then is pooped out and then goes back into the snail. That fluke can carry a rickettsia organism, a bacteria, which isn't doing much harm until a dog decides to eat the fish, the trout, the salmon, or a salamander, and where it can be in there. And then that is not the normal host. And this dog then can be very sick and get a syndrome related to tick-borne diseases that we can treat. Now, the bad news is that salmon poisoning is 90% fatal untreated. That's super bad. And so we certainly can see some really sick cases that we need to support through it. And we only see it up here in the Northwest. I hope that helped. Thank you.